Introduction. Historical background. Essential to understanding. Understanding the historical and cultural context is key to fully grasping Jesus' teaching. Matthew 6:22 through 23 and Luke 11:33 through 36 reference concepts that were familiar to a first century Jewish audience. And to interpret these passages correctly, one must consider the metaphorical language Jesus used and how it related to common beliefs about light, vision, and spiritual insight. Historical background. Point number one, Jewish understanding of the healthy and evil eye. Understanding the historical and cultural context is crucial for interpreting Jesus' words in Matthew 6:22 through 23 and Luke 11:33 through 36. In Jewish thought, the eye was linked to a person's moral and spiritual condition. A healthy eye, in Greek, is haplos, symbolized generosity and sincerity, and a bad eye, in Greek, paneros, represented greed and envy and selfishness. Reference Proverbs 28:22 and Deuteronomy 15:9. Interpretation and application. Jesus' Jewish audience would have understood that he was warning against greed and materialism. This connects to the teaching on storing treasures in heaven, as we see in Matthew 6:19 through 21, and spiritual vision, how one perceives wealth, generosity, and devotion to God determines their moral state. Point number two on historical background. Light and darkness in Jewish and Greco-Roman thought. Light and darkness in Jewish thought. The metaphor of light versus darkness was deeply rooted in Jewish tradition, symbolizing wisdom versus ignorance, righteousness versus sin, divine truth versus deception. See Isaiah 42 verses 6 through 7, which speaks of God's servant, often interpreted as our Messiah, bringing light to the nations and opening blind eyes, pointing to spiritual awakening. Dead Sea Scrolls in the Qumran community. The Essenes, a Jewish sect, wrote about a battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. This reflects Jewish apocalyptic thought, where light symbolizes divine revelation and darkness represents rejection of truth. Light and darkness in Greco-Roman thought. Greek and Roman cultures also used light-related imagery, often linking it to wisdom, knowledge, and divine guidance. In Plato's allegory of the cave, as we see in Plato's The Republic, Plato compares ignorance to living in darkness and enlightenment to seeing the light. In Stoicism, it's taught that moral clarity was like a lamp guiding one's actions in an ethical life. How this affects interpretation? Well, in Matthew's version, it emphasizes that if one's moral vision is corrupt, focused on greed, their whole life will be full of spiritual darkness and ruin. In Luke's version, it highlights how Jesus has the light that people must either accept or reject. Luke's audience, including Gentiles, would have connected this imagery to both Jewish and apocalyptic themes and the Greek philosophical traditions that valued enlightenment. Closing thought. The themes of light and darkness in both Jewish and Greco-Roman thought reinforce the significance of Jesus' teaching, whether through Jewish apocalyptic expectations or Greek philosophical insights. Light symbolizes truth, wisdom, and divine revelation. Jesus challenges, and he challenges his audience and us to examine our spiritual sight. Are you walking in the light of God's truth, or are we blinded by ignorance, greed, or rejection of his message? True enlightenment comes not just from knowledge, but from embracing Christ as the ultimate source of light. Historical background, point number 3. Placement of the sayings in Matthew and Luke's Gospel. Redaction history. Found in the Sermon on the Mount, a discourse on righteousness, devotion, and materialism. Followed by Matthew 6:24. No one can serve two masters. You cannot serve both God and money. This reinforces the idea that the eye metaphor is about one's attitude toward wealth and devotion to God. And the placement in Luke's Gospel is found in a section discussing signs and rejecting Jesus' message, Luke 11:29 through 32. In context comes after Jesus rebukes those demanding a sign, emphasizing that they already have enough light to believe but refuse to see. Luke 11:36 is unique to Luke's account, shifting focus to the total transformation that happens when someone fully accepts Jesus' revelation. How this affects interpretation. Matthew's audience, the Jewish Christians, would have understood the healthy eye as a call to generosity and undivided devotion to God. Luke's audience, including the Gentiles, would have seen the light within you as a call to accept Jesus, teaching and avoiding spiritual blindness. Closing thought. These two gospel placements show that Jesus' teaching on spiritual sight is both practical and theological. It's about how we handle wealth and devotion, as in Matthew, but also whether we truly see and accept Jesus as the light, as seen in Luke. The challenge for us today is to examine our own hearts. Are we allowing God's light to fill us, or are we clinging to the darkness? Historical background, point number 4. Economic and social context of first century Palestine. Economic disparity. Society had a vast gap between the rich and the poor, and many of Jesus' followers were poor, oppressed, or burdened by Roman taxation. Wealth and religious views. Wealth was often seen as a sign of God's favor, and Jesus challenged this mindset, warning against greed, materialism, and misplaced trust in wealth. Almsgiving in Jewish tradition. Giving to the poor was considered an act of righteousness. The contrast between a generous eye and a selfish eye reflects one's heart and devotion to God. How this affects interpretation. Matthew's Gospel challenges the belief that wealth signifies righteousness. It warns that greed corrupts one's spiritual vision, leading to darkness. In Luke's Gospel, it ties spiritual blindness to rejecting Jesus' message, reinforces that the kingdom of God belongs to the poor and open-hearted. Closing thought. Jesus' teaching on wealth and generosity calls believers to examine their hearts. A spiritually healthy life isn't measured by material success, but by generosity, humility, and a clear vision fixed on God's kingdom. Historical background, conclusion. Key takeaways. Historical factors to consider. The Jewish understanding of the eye. Light versus darkness in Jewish and Greco-Roman thought. Gospel context and audience. First century economic and social context. Matthew 6:22 through 23. The spiritual vision and wealth. A healthy eye represents generosity and righteousness, while an evil eye symbolizes greed and selfishness. Light signifies spiritual clarity and moral integrity, while darkness reflects corrupt desires, especially greed. In context, in Matthew's Gospel, it's part of the Sermon on the Mount, emphasizing wealth and devotion to God. Jewish listeners would recognize the evil eye as an idiom for greed. Challenges materialism in a culture that equated wealth with God's blessing. In Luke 11:33 through 36, the spiritual sight in Jesus' message. Less emphasis on wealth and focusing instead on openness to God's truth. Light represents Jesus' revelation and divine wisdom, while darkness reflects the rejection of his teaching. In context, in Luke's gospel, was placed in a passage addressing skepticism towards Jesus' signs, and appeals to both Jewish and Gentile audiences, warning against spiritual blindness. It criticizes religious elites and skeptics who reject Jesus' message. In conclusion, understanding Jewish idioms, the symbolism of light and darkness, and first century economic conditions deepens our interpretation of these passages. In Matthew's version, it highlights how spiritual vision shapes one's devotion to God, particularly in matters of wealth and righteousness. In Luke's version, it focuses on recognizing and accepting Jesus as the source of divine truth. Closing thought. True spiritual sight comes from aligning our hearts with God's truth. Whether through generosity, humility, or embracing Jesus' teachings, our ability to see clearly determines how we walk in